Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the FCC. Please proceed with your lunch. I have not 10 minutes, but almost of announcements. We have a packed month of March coming, so I will quickly update you on all this while you finish your lunch and before I introduce our speaker. My name is Florence de Changy. I'm the correspondent for Le Monde and the current president of the club. I'm delighted to be the host today. So, before the coming up events, we have actually two special events for the club. On Saturday, we have the charity ball, and there are still a few tickets, and I strongly encourage all of you to make the most of this party. It's a very good deal for a party, and it's also a very good mission that and charity that we support, the kids in kindergarten. So please consider that. And the following week, we have a whole-day journalism conference. So the whole club is turned around, except the main bar, to discuss journalism nowadays. And the theme this year is dangers in journalism. Now, coming up until the end of the month, we have almost 10 events. I think we're breaking a record this month. On Monday, we'll host French journalist, filmmaker, producer, and now NGO creator, basically founder, Frédéric Bedos, who is proposing journalism of hope. Some people here, including Eric, had a big laugh when I pitched the idea of putting hope into journalism, but I think it's worth giving it a go. After that, on Tuesday, we have two events giving a hard time to China, because one is called China's War on the Internet, that's on Tuesday, and the next day it's how China is muzzling the media. So, sorry about that, but we have, look at the details. And then next Thursday, we're discussing with the former India ambassador to the UN, Dilip Sinha, the relevance of the UN Security Council and how it can survive a new Cold War. And we then have a few evening events. We're screening Abacus, Small Enough to Jail, very interesting documentary about how a small bank went into trouble, and we will have the CEO of this bank as a speaker. We will also host as an evening event, so it will be like a dinner, Alan Rusbridger, who is the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian. This is Wednesday, March the 27th. And he will talk about why journalism matters more than ever and how it has to adapt to survive. Alan Rusbridger is currently the chairman of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. And one more event to announce, also a movie, Last Boat Out of Shanghai. No, sorry, I think that's a book. I'm getting confused. We have so many events. Yes, with Ellen Zia, Last Boat Out of Shanghai and the Forgotten Exodus to Hong Kong and Beyond. So please, make the most of this fantastic program coming up. And now to today's great talk. I'm delighted to have Dr. Mary Mendras, who is a leading European scholar on Russia and Ukraine. She's based in Paris, but she's currently on an exchange program with the Hong Kong Baptist University. She knows a lot about Russia and about Putin, who is not her friend. And she asked me to not say too much before she speaks. So apart from the fact that she obviously speaks fluent Russian and is very familiar with the situation, without further ado, please welcome Mary Mendras.
Bonjour et merci pour votre présence aujourd'hui. I'm really happy to meet with you in this wonderful place. Britain really is my second country. My first visit to England to learn English, I was 10 years old. And England and the English language are really my first love. I was a professor at the London School of Economics 10 years ago, and I loved lunching at my male friends' clubs. And last night was short, as I couldn't but watch the House of Commons debate and feel very sad. I don't think I will cheer you up with Russia, but at least, it will be a change of scene. Winston Churchill is often called to the rescue when Western commentators fall short of convincing explanations about Russia. I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia, he said. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. How many millions times we've heard this? The British Prime Minister was speaking in October 1939. Russia was Stalin, USSR, just after the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, an infamous secret protocol. Russia is no enigma to me, and this is why Florence kindly invited me to speak today. Russia is a moving object, though, and a constant challenge to me and to all of us. Surely the Kremlin is not an open book. Putin and his media lie a lot, and people lie to Putin as well. There is no such thing as a well-informed, non-democratic leadership. But their behavior can be studied, their achievements as well as their blunders, defeats, miscalculations. And Ukraine is a case in point. I hope I have half a minute to discuss the situation in Ukraine. What I would like to do today is start with a few maps. A few maps that Vladimir Vladimirovich doesn't like to see, and show that Russia's vast territory, although a quarter smaller than the USSR and only less than half of the population of the former USSR, that Russia's territory may have become a burden. Secondly, I will ask the question, is Russia still a great power? Can a superpower that failed and fell be again a world power? Even with oil and gas, nuclear weapons, and a propensity to intervene in neighbor states? And my third argument will be that Vladimir Putin is a problem. Russia has a Putin problem, and we have a Putin problem. So the maps that Putin doesn't like to see. Former Soviet Union, and you have to add to this, of course, the Warsaw Pact countries of Central Europe and Eastern Europe and Mongolia, the friendly hostages of the Soviet project. This is a map of real Russia in terms of human geography. This is where people live in Russia. So you see that only a quarter, really, of the territory is densely populated. And the other 3/4 are either not populated at all or not much populated. And in fact, the demography is not getting any better. So this map will not evolve in any way to sort of unify the country. I am not going to add more maps about great differentiations in standards of living, differentiations in resources, and great differences in GDP per habitant throughout the Federation of Russia. Those maps, are not really to be maybe taken very seriously, but I think in the case of Russia, because I'm always told, but Russia is such a vast country. Well, you don't find Russia on this map. It's a very thin, light green line on the top of China. And this is wealth. You don't see it either because it's so fine. So what I mean is that in the world of today, everything is relative and everything is about competition, unless you really go for protectionism, which might be the option that the Putin regime is going for, and which, in a nutshell, I label aggressive retrenchment. This is a crucial map that Vladimir Putin would never accept. But it is a real map. On this map, you see that after the annexation of Crimea and military intervention in eastern Donbass, Ukraine has become a central, big, relatively big state in European standards, big state at the very center of the European continent. And of course, on this European continent where you include a good part of Russia if you wish to. What is also interesting about this map is that the pink part of Russia is the populated part of Russia. So that you see that Russia, yes, is a big country on the continent, but surrounded also with other big countries, and most of them doing better economically. Of course, this is the map that Vladimir Putin prefers, the map of the socialist camp in '89. But this map has no chance of reappearing on our screens. And I will try to explain why Putin's decision to intervene in Ukraine are not a sign of a desire to reconquer the former Soviet Union, but rather to spoil the sovereignty of former republics. Very quickly, just because I guess you might be wondering about Ukraine, this map also is not very popular inside the Kremlin. Every region of Ukraine, including Crimea, voted for the independence of Ukraine in December '91, a few days before the formal collapse of the Soviet Union. And now we are in Asia, the new Silk Road, or I understand that it's OBOR, One Belt, One Road here, or BRI. Well, you know this much better than I do. Look at this map. Think of China, Chinese economic capacity and military capacity. And I don't see Russia winning in this new initiative launched by the Chinese president in 2013. press freedom that you know also better than I do. What you also see in this map is that there is no resurgence of an East-West divide on the continent or in transatlantic relations, and it is a Russia-West divide. This is important, and I'll come to this in a minute, is that Russia in many ways is more isolated today in the region and in world politics than it was 10 years ago. So it doesn't look like military interventions have made Russia in a way more central or more popular in the international community. So now, the first question, great power. It's often, the question we are asking ourselves. Yes, we know Russia is not doing very well economically or socially or politically, but they are a great power in the sense that they can intervene or choose to intervene in Syria, in Ukraine. They can try and be more friendly with China because they probably feel they're strong enough to do this. To analyze the situation and try to answer this question, I think we need very quickly to do a short stock-taking of 20 years of Putin in Russia. Inside an economy that is not growing, and it looks like will not have a fresh start even if oil and gas prices rise. This is a major change with the situation before the financial world crisis of 2008. We observe an unproductive, corrupt system of preferences and disguised monopolies, or hardly disguised monopolies. Russia and the Russian industry have been short of investments, both Russian investment and foreign investment, for years. And you can imagine that the Ukraine conflict has not made the situation any better. It is not an accountable government, and it is not a pluralistic, competitive society in the sense that elections are neither completely free nor completely fair, because opposition leaders cannot run and opposition parties cannot even register. As I hope I might have a few minutes at the end to go into the problem of Putinism today, what I've been observing, and this is really my major theme of research, is how elites are becoming more and more worried. I mean, both the ruling elites and the non-ruling elites, people like us, professional elites, many of them choosing to emigrate. And the shrinking middle class is also very, very worried. And probably the average Russian as well, but the average Russian is becoming more and more difficult to study. Outside, what is the situation? If, we look back 20 years. 20 years ago, the new president of Russia had many partners. He had strong partners in the EU. And after 9/11, a strong partner was George W. Bush. He today has fewer partners, fewer friends, and more rivals. And this is the reality if you look at the United Nations voting patterns, both in the Security Council and in the General Assembly, you can see this. For example, I remember, I think one of the first resolutions, I think against Ukraine and presented by Russia. General Assembly, I think only 10 states and the usual suspects voted for the Russian resolution against Ukraine in 2014. You can imagine the usual suspects, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Syria. What is interesting is then China abstained. And you will find a pattern that shows how reticent the China's leadership is about their Russian neighbor actually going for territorial intervention outside their borders. So what I see is that the Putin leadership has been choosing confrontation. They have preferred confrontation and even conflict to the many possibilities of negotiations. I've been following very closely the Minsk process about the Donbass conflict. I've been part of the sort of off conferences and off summits and all. And I know that options were there. And I know how Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Hollande, representing the EU, were capable of forcing Vladimir Putin to come to the meetings. So we do have at least that authority on him, and that he has to take Chancellor Merkel's phone calls, and he has to come and talk to us. And this is certainly what we have to keep going. What I know also is that in the last 20 years, security in Russia has not improved. And in the Northern Caucasus, in the small republics of the North Caucasus, and not just Chechnya, the situation for the population there is more and more difficult. And actually, it's interesting how Moscow has built, without saying so, of course, a form of sanitary cordon around the North Caucasus. When you talk to people in Moscow, tell you, oh, Marie, but the North Caucasus, it's no longer Russia. We also have a situation of confrontation, of very tense relations now between Moscow and most of the capitals of former republics of the Soviet Union. Don't believe that Putin and Lukashenko have a good relationship, the Belarus president. No. And so this also is a major change in the sense that, the color revolutions have happened in the last 20 years, and I think so far a rather successful Maidan revolution in Ukraine. So even the in-between countries, the 6 countries that are stuck between Russia and Europe, between Russia and the West, between Russia and NATO, are now wanting to find a safe exit from too much dependence on Moscow. And this is, this is relatively new. And Moscow's response has been, we have a sphere of privileged interest, and we will rewrite the narrative of events in Ukraine, and we are legitimate in intervening. But the result, clearly, is that the Russian government has lost Ukraine, and probably for good. And we might see in a few years that the political, social, and even economic situation in Ukraine might be sounder than in the vast federation of Russia. So interestingly, we have a paradox that the intervention in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, has killed the very concept of sphere of privilege interest, or near abroad, as Moscow used to call their former republics. This region no longer exists. Now you have 6 sovereign states trying to exist and secure their position, and they know that for that they have to have closer relations with European countries. Doesn't mean that they will join soon, but they are moving closer. Take the case of Armenia and the new government in Armenia that is trying to do fine, move closer to Europe and rule of law, political system, and at the same time maintain relatively good relations with Russia, because they are military dependent, of course, on Russia because of their dispute with Azerbaijan about Nagorno-Karabakh. The war in Syria, was it an anti-West intervention? Were the Russians fighting Islamic terrorism? Who will rebuild Syria when the time comes and it's possible to rebuild? Who was most active in bringing humanitarian assistance? Who is telling the truth about the nearly 500,000 casualties and millions of refugees and injured? You know the answer. You know the answer. I don't have much time, but I will be most happy to answer your questions about Russia's involvement and full support, and military support, financial support of Bashar al-Assad. What I would like to stress now is that the great part of experts, scholars, even official journalists in Russia are critical of both the intervention in Donbass and the intervention in Syria. Some of them even feel strong enough that the regime needs them, and they write about it. It's not just private talks with me. I can also tell you, but with a little more caution, because it has become almost impossible to do reliable representative polls in Russia, but those interventions are not popular either. The Russians are just like us. They don't like war. They had enough traumas in their history. They were hugely against the first war in Chechnya under Yeltsin, and they don't feel it's right. So, is Russia great again? I think in the views of the Russian elites, informed people, relatively well-informed people, no. You won't find anybody telling you, yes, it's wonderful, our economy is dwindling, but we have restored our authority and respect in world affairs. Now, clearly, the Russian government is back on stage after almost a 2-year period of serious isolation after the annexation of Crimea. But probably they had higher expectations when they started to feel that if they intervened more directly in Syria in September 15, that they would catch the eye of Washington and that they would be included in a larger coalition in Syria, and they would have the lead with Washington. At the time, I was on sabbatical in Washington, and I remember that very clearly. And I don't think I'm mistaken about what Putin's calculations were at the time. Now, how many minutes do I have left? A few. Fine. So I'll keep those few minutes for the Putin problem. Vladimir Putin and his system of rule, because in Russia you never hear about government or you hear about власть, power, and система, the system. It's an old word, and the Russians love to say система. It's not an administration. It's not an institutional system. It's a system. Networks, everything very non-transparent. So this Putin systema is an aging regime. Elites are more and more frustrated. Society is more and more worried. And what the sense I have been studying the societies of Russia and Ukraine and Georgia for many, many years, the sense I have is that people in the late 1980s and early 1990s, thanks to Gorbachev's perestroika, glasnost, the opening up, traveling, people had regained the capacity to dream about a future, about building something, about investing, having a bright future for their children. People were dreaming, and I loved that period. I think professionally it was the most wonderful period in my life. Also, for the first time in 1989 or 90, I could just walk in a train station in Moscow, buy any ticket to go anywhere, and nobody would ask me, are you foreign? Do you have a visa? Even though formally I would have needed a visa. So there were expectations. Then they came down with the crisis of the 1990s, but then up again with the golden years of 2000, 2008, with the constant rise in oil and gas prices and increasing purchasing power and living standards throughout the decade. Now people stop dreaming. They don't make plans. When they can, they try to secure their children's education or assets outside Russia. Sometimes in Ukraine, and certainly in the Baltic states, or Poland, or Turkey, or it's only a minority, but China, for some of them, for business reasons. You might ask me, but don't we read everywhere that Putin is popular? No, he's not popular. In a non-pluralistic, non-competitive election where a lot of rigging is taking place, if you have a choice between Putin or chaos, that doesn't mean if you vote for Putin or if you say, I support Putin's actions, it doesn't mean that he is popular. In political science, popularity is a relative concept. You are more popular than the other candidate. And this is, in fact, what Putin is now experiencing, that even the expressed opinion in official polls is falling because people have stopped having perspectives and they have stopped trusting the systema, and they are starting to stop trusting Putin. What will happen? It's certainly a dangerous period for Russians and for many other countries, and not just because of the policies of the Kremlin. I think what will not happen in the years to come is a sound economic recovery in Russia and a fight against social inequalities that are really, really, I think, the major question in Russia today. I don't think in the next few years we'll see a true reconciliation between the Russian states and Western nations and the EU, because Putin shows no desire to negotiate on Ukraine and a number of other issues, not even to mention human rights and free elections. What will happen, in my view, is certainly more discontent in Russia, more insecurity in the North Caucasus and a few other regions of Russia. Probably no military exit from Donbass or Syria for the Russian military, and certainly also a stronger China in the relationship with Russia. What might happen in the next few years? Maybe a weaker government in Russia because of the more and more dysfunctional system. Probably more protest, which will mean at the beginning more repression. But repression is not effective in Russia. It's not communist China. It's not communist China. You can't silence people. And the internet is mostly free. I can go. I mean, I was there in November. I'll go in May. And I always speak there, the way I speak and write anywhere else. And have never run into any serious problem. My temporary conclusion about our European policies, this is what I know best besides Russia and Ukraine, is to try hard to stay together in this rough weather, forge a common security policy and not just energy policy and ecology policy, pursue the Minsk process, even though it's not going to deliver a full solution, but because it forces Putin to the table. Maintain a permanent line of communication with the government, but also with alternative elites, because alternative elites are there. We know them. Never let the leadership hide in a bunker. Talk and offer options, and as much as possible reach out to the Russians, whether they live in Russia or outside Russia. In other words, prepare the future, because there will be a post-Putin system Russia. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Marie. That was great. Yes, please raise with your hands and introduce yourself. Priority to journalists or Russian in the room. Yes, here, please.
Thank you very much. Tom Holland, various affiliations, including occasionally the South China Morning Post. Please forgive my almost complete ignorance of Russia, but I wonder if I could present to you a different perspective.
Sure.
And ask for your comments.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, the Putin regime has been extraordinarily successful at creating frozen conflicts in Ukraine, in Georgia, etc., that have effectively halted the eastward expansion of the European Union, which Russia saw as a threat. With its Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline deal, it has effectively co-opted Germany, the EU's biggest power, and neutralized any voices of opposition in the former Warsaw Pact. With its alliance with OPEC to support oil prices, it has reaped the greatest gains of anyone from higher oil prices, and with its alliance with Iran and its intervention in Syria, it has effectively, as you say, isolated the North Caucasus and undermined its biggest strategic rival, the US, in the Middle East. In effect, Putin's regime has been extraordinarily successful at stabilizing and promoting Russia's power in the world. Isn't that true?
Okay. I think it's excellent for me that you present it this way, because none of the argument works. There are no frozen conflicts in Europe or at the vicinity of Europe. There is a hot conflict in Donbass. There is a very unstable situation in Crimea. There is a Nagorno-Karabakh question, which may be one of what you call a frozen situation, but that is going to change because now we have a new government in Armenia that has a true interest in finding a solution. And then we have Transnistria in Moldova, which I would say is really what is left if the Russian army still wants to, bite. For the rest, I mean, don't have much time to go into Georgia. Georgia is a complicated country, but I think you have to believe me because I don't have much time to develop this. But I was working very closely with the French authorities during the Georgia War of early August 2008 and afterwards. And I can assure you that Vladimir Putin did not anticipate our reactions, Nicolas Sarkozy's trip. We cannot rewrite history and know for sure what might have happened had the Europeans and NATO not say, listen, you have to stop. But I know that in Russia they did not anticipate a strong reaction because it was not as strong as in Ukraine in early 2014 for a number of reasons. But still, if you take the case of Ukraine, the Kremlin did not anticipate developments in Ukraine. And this is why they're building a fake narrative on the fact that Yanukovych was forced out by a coup. Of course, it wasn't a coup, and the government and the parliament of Ukraine were legitimately elected, and it was a peaceful transition, and most of the casualties took place in Donbass, where the Russians are military involved. The Nord Stream, even if it happens, I think, in the oil prices, I tried to make a point quickly that even the rise in hydrocarbon prices recently, in the last 2 years or so, have not helped growth of the Russian economy. Finally, Putin wanted to undermine the United States, but it's just the opposite. Vladimir Putin, in the long tradition of Soviet policies, was, he just really was hoping for a new grand strategic parity with Washington, and that's why he made his phone call to George W. Bush the day after or the day of the 9/11 tragedy, and that's what he was hoping for, is to bring back Russia at the top of the world, thanks to a strategic parity and partnership with the United States. And there was great disappointment when that started to crumble as early as late 2003. Now, I know that Eric is very interested in fake news and cyber attacks, and so let me just drop this analysis that I'm sure many of you won't buy easily. Again, I was in Washington, living in Washington at the time. I don't believe that the Kremlin and the FSB and wanted Donald Trump to be elected. Which means that don't expect from this kind of leadership that is greatly disinformed by its own administrations and services and fake journalism. Don't expect them to have grand strategy and never to make mistakes. They make mistakes, and maybe even more than democratic governments, because they have no critical analysis around them.
Thank you. Next question. Here.
Nick Thompson, no affiliation. Do the Russian people believe the PR that comes out of the Russian government? I ask this because a friend of mine I was at school with has lived in Russia for a long time now, and he still believes that those Russian agents that went to Salisbury Cathedral were there sightseeing. And I thought of him
a good laugh
as an intelligent man.
A good laugh. But I think your question is very important. I don't know what Russians think, because there are about 140 million people who live in Russia. Most of them don't express themselves. They can't be studied. I don't know. I don't think there's a Russian nation. Russia today is certainly not a nice, strong nation state. But that would be a long conversation. So the way I can answer your question is this. Is that first, the leadership's behavior. Why do they resort to fake news, smear campaigns? Why do they lie to the public? Why do they do it? What are they gaining from it? I would say that when it comes to themselves, that by using and abusing media fakes and subversion, that the Putin leadership are disclosing a lot about themselves and a lot about their vulnerabilities and their own anxiety. And that's the other side of control. You control, but then it becomes dysfunctional. Okay? Now, how many people want to believe the official speech and the official narratives coming from the Kremlin? It's interesting that many Russians or non-Russians who have lived in Russia and now live elsewhere tend to believe the narrative more readily than people who never lived there and just study or. So I think there is something maybe emotional. If you take the case of France, those who will discount facts and good journalism or good scholarship on Russia are usually anti-American, often anti-European, more often than not souverainist, which is the word we use for our sort of populist trends in France. A population, a society that has no institutional public channels of expression is, in a way, a dormant society. People can wake up, but there's very little chance that the leadership will be made aware of what's happening in the настроение, in the way people feel.
Thank you. We still have time for maybe 2 questions. I know Eric has one. Sorry. Maybe, Mary, you will need to go quickly.
Yeah, or maybe I'll take more questions. I'll take the questions together.
You talked about the US election. What's your analysis of the Trump-Putin relationship? How do you think Putin views his relationship with Trump, and what's he going to get out of it?
A riddle, in an enigma, in a mystery, Yes, please.
It's Mao Chi-wang. I'm a retired journalist. During your talk, you mentioned that the people in Russia have no more dream. And this is quite striking to me. As a Hong Kong Chinese, I just want to ask a very simple question. Now, people in China now, they have according to the Communist Party propaganda, they sell that it's a one belt, one road, have a lot of Chinese dream. Whereas in Russian, people have no dream. Now, my question is very simple. I just want you, from your political observation, to compare the difference and similarity between the person of Russian Putin and also China Xi Jinping.
You want me to compare them?
To compare these 2 political characters.
I think there's a lady there as well, right?
Yeah, and then third and last question. Well, Elaine, do you want to put in your question? And you will have 5 minutes to reply to the 4 questions.
Elaine Pickering, I mean, kind of along those lines, you said that the Russian people have no dreams anymore, but what can they hope for?
Okay, thank you. And then Jean-Pierre Cabestan here.
Well, thank you, Mary, for coming to Hong Kong and to Hong Kong Baptist University, which is my university.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, for inviting me.
Well, you've given us a very reassuring message, in a sense, in insisting that Russia is a declining power, but it's still giving us European a lot of headaches.
Yes.
So they can't. And there are a number of things you haven't mentioned. I would like to push you a bit further. You haven't mentioned the fact that Russia has been very good at dividing the Europeans, a bit like China has been dividing Europe. And look at the Italians, which have now embraced the Belt and Road Initiative. The same for Russia. Russia has a lot of supporters in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe even more so, for some countries at least. So how do you evaluate Russia's support in Europe, in the EU? And the final thing is, you haven't mentioned the fact that Russia is still a nuclear power. Which
not the only one.
Yes, but I mean it still plays in the big countries kind of courtyard in that respect. And the Russians' argument has been that we've stopped the eastern expansion of NATO, and you haven't mentioned very much NATO. So can you tell us more about that? Because it's one of those achievements that Putin would sort of claim as a result of his presidency. So I would like to push
you've got
thank you.
Yes, like 5 minutes, not a few.
Oh,
just
I have 5 minutes.
To
Wonderful.
answer these 4 questions.
I have 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Marie.
Okay. Maybe I will start with the one question on domestic Russia and what can they hope for? A lot. Ukraine has been happening. Armenia has been happening. Georgia is happening. Belarus will happen one day. Moldova is half happening. It's a more complicated story, and you were right, because they have the Russian army in Transnistria. No, but what I mean is that Russians today, if they want to, they can open the window So they need to want to. And this is why I use this Russian term of настроение. Is do they feel like taking the risk of opening the window and understanding fully what their country is doing, you know, when it should be much better off. I mean, just think for a minute. If the Putin leadership had been a true government, rule of law, thanks to the oil and gas prices, how prosperous and happy and more equal Russian society would be today. This is the way to think. Think of the other option, of not having an authoritarian system. So I think what is important, absolutely essential, is that we, all Western democracies, and we support what deserves support, which are political movements and legitimate governments that want to move in the direction of rule of law and openness. And their first objective is not to join the EU and NATO. And I think it is a mistake to state that NATO wanted to expand east or the EU wanted to expand east. Again, the 1990s are a period where I followed those issues very closely, close to the inside the French government, really. And we were bagged by all the former Warsaw Pact countries and the Baltic states to take them in quickly because they didn't feel secure with the Yeltsin government and the commitment to their full sovereignty. Now, that's my opening to the three questions that are relations with Moscow. Jean-Pierre, yes, a country like Russia, which in the 1990s was a superpower that failed and could not rebuild itself. Yes, a country that is led by a non-democratic leadership that tends to go for the use of force rather than negotiate. Even if it is in a crisis, and it is in a crisis, it can bite. And actually what is interesting is often what I hear in European capitals is, oh, but you know, we shouldn't criticize Putin too much because he might get angrier. So I think we are saying exactly how we feel. You know, we are concerned about the troubled years ahead. But there will be those troubled years again. And if we wanted to support Putin's adventures and forget about the 45 million people who live in Ukraine, it would be a great mistake. So yes, Russia is still one of our headaches. And Russia is the European continent. It is there. And this is why we Europeans do not treat Russia and the Russians with the same distance as we could treat the Chinese people under communist power, or Saudi Arabia, or Russia is just next door, especially now with Ukraine getting out of the grip of a non-rule of law system. Xi and Putin, I really cannot answer. I wish I knew President Xi. I've met Vladimir Putin several times, but not President Xi. I'm going to Beijing soon. I'm not sure he will accept to see me. Trump-Putin, Eric. Again, it's a long conversation. It's the story of wrong expectations on both sides. Really. I mean, both Trump and Putin had the wrong picture, the wrong narrative, and just a few weeks after Trump was elected, the relationship between the two men clearly could not even start. They don't have a relationship in the sense they don't have a personal relationship, certainly no trust, and their two administrations, as you know, have the worst possible relation in decade in the Washington-Moscow relations.
Well, thank you very much, Marie. I'm afraid we have to end here, but it was fascinating, and I suggest we will applaud Marie for this fantastic talk. Thank you. Continue. You're writing.